They're on top of the world. They're at number 22 in our pipeline rankings. We're focused mainly on the top 10. But here are the rest of the NHL clubs that did not end up among the top 10 in our countdown. It's worth noting that for Vegas, it's a different approach, cause this is something, when we were talking earlier, you had a strong opinion and a really unique insight into there's different ways to get to the top. Can they stay at the top the way that they do business?
Well, it's going to be fascinating to see moving forward how it works out for the Vegas Golden Knights. But I think of the Golden Knights as a team that treats its players and its prospects more like assets than any other team in the National Hockey League. It is all business all the time. And you think back to the days of Nate Schmidt or Marc-Andre Fleury when those guys moved on from Vegas and how much they meant to the start of the franchise. And then I think about 2017. That's their first draft. They had 3 first-round picks in that draft. It started with Cody Glass, Nick Suzuki, and Erik Brannstrom. All 3 of those players were moved to get something that would help them more immediately. And I think Cody Glass is starting to come a little bit. So too is Brannstrom. I think we know what Nick Suzuki is. But I think about this is a franchise that's looking at asset management, pure and simple. When you look at their winning team on the ice for the Stanley Cup, Nick Hague's the only guy drafted by Vegas. That first draft, 4 of the first 5 players, Jake Leschyshyn also has moved on from Vegas. So it's really interesting to see that they've been able to do that when all we ever hear about, Mike, is draft and develop, how important it is. I still believe very strongly in that. This is a circuitous route to get to a Stanley Cup, but it worked for Vegas, and you have to give them credit for doing so.
Everybody's always looking at who won the Stanley Cup, who got to the Stanley Cup final, and what are they doing, right? Can we replicate this? It's a copycat league, and for good reason. That's fair enough. I think where this is unique for Vegas, though, and this is not something that every team can replicate, is that it's a destination to play for the Vegas Golden Knights, right? They can afford to do this because Mark Stone wants to be there. Alex Pietrangelo wants to be there. Guys want to come to Vegas for a lot of different reasons. Great place to live, great environment, winning team.
Taxes.
Tax money, right? It checks all the boxes. Other teams don't have the luxury to be able to attract all these other players that you don't have to draft and develop. So there are still plenty of teams in the league that have to draft and develop and do it that way. I still think that's the norm and will continue to be the norm. This is more of an outlier. But to your point, they were pretty cutthroat with how they were going to do it, and they did. They literally accomplished the goal in the year that they said they would right from the beginning, right?
Yeah, impressive. And credit where credit's due for sure when it comes to that kind of situation. But I do still think that the norm is going to be, especially in a salary cap era, even when we know the cap is going to go up, that you're going to have to draft and develop your own players for long-term sustainability.
To follow up on his point about a copycat league, in terms of the draft, there are always trends. What trend did you see this year at the draft?
Well, when I was looking at this year's draft, you saw smaller, skilled forwards, but you also saw things revert back to size. And some of those smaller, skilled forwards that we talked about going early in the draft from about the start of the year to the midway point, by the time we got to the draft at the end of June, some of those players had slipped. The Zach Bensons, the Braden Yagers of the world, who were top 10 guys going in, slipped down into the 10 to 20 range. And then we started to see size really take over. I look at Reinbacher at the start. I look at Simashev when he was picked. You're talking about guys that are much bigger because, hey, what did we see? We see the Vegas Golden Knights with size, being able to grind down teams, 4 lines worth of depth. Those things came to the fore as part of that copycat league that we're talking about with the championship team.
Especially in the back end. I mean, you look at the defensemen for successful playoff teams in recent years. Vegas Golden Knights are no exception to this. They're big. They got guys that are big that can skate. And I've had multiple executives, people in the NHL say, you can win with 1 defenseman under 6 feet tall, but you can't have more than 1, right? And as a general rule, fair enough. If you've got a couple of Cale Makars in your team, you're going to be fine. But as a general rule, you want guys with size, and that's what we're watching be successful in the league right now, especially on the blue line. That said, I still love the younger guys, or the smaller guys, I should say. And it's a balance. You have to find that balance, right? How many centers are in the league, top centers in the league that are under 5'10"? It's not many. So maybe a guy can move to the wing. Maybe the guy's the exception. That's where you got to try to find, who's going to be that outlier potentially.
The average Vegas defenseman, and I remember this graphic vividly from their run to the Cup and winning it, just over 6'2", 217 pounds. How hard is it to find that kind of player, knowing that that is the template that you're looking for?
Well, defensemen typically take a little bit longer as well. So now you're thinking about, okay, we're going to draft this guy at 18. We're going to need probably 2 to 3 years to see where he sorts himself out in terms of his amateur career. And then he probably needs a year at least in the American Hockey League before he steps in. Now, we've seen some outliers and some exceptions, the Mo Siders being that type of example, but it doesn't happen often for defensemen. And Mike, you made the point earlier in the show that bigger players take a little bit longer to develop. So not only do you have a position that takes longer to develop, you have a typically sized bigger player that takes longer to develop.
It doesn't take long to develop an interest in the prospect pool. As a fan, you want to know what's coming next.